May I approach to retrieve evidence?
You may.
May I proceed?
You may.
Ladies and gentlemen, what happened that night was a tragedy. What happened that night was a tragic accident. But it wasn't murder. Danny Dawson, Taylor Hobson, and Vanessa Sullivan were three friends who were celebrating a 21st birthday. And as they left that bar, they said goodbye to Jordan James, the bartender. They said goodbye to Pat Lawrence, their waiter. And they said goodbye to everyone else in the bar. And as they walked out of that bar, Jordan James, he didn't try and take the keys from Danny Dawson. Taylor Hobson and Vanessa Sullivan, they didn't ask Jordan James to take the keys from Danny Dawson. Pat Lawrence, she didn't take the keys from Danny Dawson. Vanessa Sullivan and Taylor Hobson, they didn't ask the waiter to take the keys from Danny Dawson. No one else who was in that bar that night, and we know that there were a lot of people in that bar, tried to take the keys from Danny Dawson. And as they walked out into the parking lot, no one tried to call a cab. Danny Dawson didn't pull out his cell phone to call a cab. Taylor Hobson didn't try and call a cab. Vanessa Sullivan didn't try and call a cab. Because everyone knew that night that Danny Dawson was okay to drive. What happened that night was not because of alcohol. What happened that night was because of the conditions. As Danny Dawson was driving home, everyone was in the car. They were laughing, they were joking around, they were having a good time. And it was dark, it was late. Mr. Dawson, he was focused. He was focused on the road in front of him. And as he's driving down Canyon Road, it starts to rain. But ladies and gentlemen, that night, it didn't just rain. It poured. Mr. Dawson, he's behind the wheel. He's got the windshield wipers going back and forth as fast as they can. But it's hard to see. It's as if the water's coming from the sky and if it's coming from the ground. He can barely see what's in front of him. There's no lights on this road. There's no passing cars coming by to provide light from their headlights. And as Mr. Dawson is driving down this road, he sees a deer. He sees a deer and he swerves to the right to try and avoid this deer. He drives onto the shoulder and into the grass, but instead of panicking, Mr. Dawson, he remains calm. He doesn't slam on the brake. He doesn't immediately overcorrect. Instead, he maintains control. He maintains control for 124 feet. He maintains control around the curve of the road. And then as he gradually tries to re-enter the road on the straight part of the road, that's when he loses control. But not because of alcohol, because of the conditions. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to determine if what happened that night constitutes first-degree murder. Now, when this trial is over and when you're deliberating, you're going to be provided with a jury instruction. And this jury instruction is to tell you and explain to you what exactly it was that the prosecution had to prove today. They had to prove these things, these two things, beyond a reasonable doubt. They had to prove, number one, he is guilty of murder, and they had to prove, number two, that he was driving under the influence of alcohol. They had to prove these things beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, beyond a reasonable doubt means that if you have reason to doubt something in this case, well, that's reasonable doubt. It's any doubt for which you have reason. I want to look more specifically at the words contained within this. First, I want to look at this word reckless, and then I want to look at these words extreme indifference to human life. Now, this first word, reckless. They had to prove, in order to prove reckless, that Danny Dawson consciously disregarded the risk of death that night. He didn't consciously disregard anything. He had 7 drinks throughout the course of 11 hours. He knew that when he got into that car, he was okay to drive. Jordan James knew when he got into that car that he was okay to drive. Everyone that was at that bar that night knew that he was okay to drive. Had he not been okay to drive, someone would have intervened. Opposing counsel's entire case for recklessness rests on whether or not you believe that he drank too much that night. So let's look at the evidence that they provided to show that. They called their expert, Avery Smith. Avery Smith provided this blood alcohol concentration analysis report, a report that brought back a reading of 0.19. And that is over the legal limit. And if this were true, Danny Dawson would have been drunk that night. Ladies and gentlemen, is there reason to doubt whether or not this is true? That same witness, Avery Smith, she had a checklist for what must be done in order to make sure that those tests are reliable. One of the things that has to be done is there has to be someone there to observe the patient. Has to be someone there to observe who the test is being administered to. And when you go back and you deliberate, you'll be able to look at this Exhibit 4. And you'll be able to see that right next to observer name, there's a blank space. That is reason to doubt the blood alcohol concentration level of 0.19. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, Avery Smith made a few assumptions that night. She assumed that this is what is required in order to be intoxicated, when in reality it was probably this. You'll notice that the difference between these two things is that this box holds 2 cubes and this box holds 1. In this case, the blood alcohol concentration was at least twice what it really was. How incorrect that reading was, we may never know. But ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, this is reason to doubt whether or not Danny Dawson was drunk. Then they called Pat Lawrence, the waiter, to talk about what happened. Mr. Lawrence, he only said that Danny Dawson drank 3 drinks. Jordan James, the bartender, said that Danny Dawson only drank 3 drinks. Now they brought this receipt and they showed it to you today, and they tried to make it seem as if Mr. Dawson bought all these drinks and therefore he drank all these drinks. But ladies and gentlemen, buying your friend's drinks does not mean that you are drunk. Buying your friend's drinks does not constitute first-degree murder. And another thing that they had to prove? They had to prove that there was extreme indifference to human life that night. They had to prove that Mr. Dawson disregarded human life. Not just the lives of the 2 passengers, but if you were to believe the prosecution's case, he would have had to have disregarded his own life. Gentlemen, that just doesn't add up. That is reason to doubt their case. That night, Mr. Dawson, he fought. He fought to maintain control of that vehicle. He fought to safely maneuver around the curve. He fought to safely come back onto the road. What happened that night was not murder. Find Mr. Dawson not guilty.